I was talking with my buddy Rob yesterday. Rob is a great dobro player who lives in the Chicago area, and he runs a page on Facebook called the Square Neck Journal, and I know him from teaching at Rob Ikes' Resophonic Summit in Nashville. And we met several years ago and talk once in a while about music, and for some reason or other, we were talking about not the dobro, and he was asking, well, like, where did you learn to play fingerstyle blues from? Like, who were your guys, and how did you learn it? And I started giving him my usual list, which is, it's basically all the guys in the 60s who learned from Gary Davis. So it was like that first Hot Tuna record, and some of the Stephen Grossman stuff, and Dave Van Ronk, like the record Sunday Street, and Roy Bookbinder, who I got to see live a bunch of times, as well as like hearing his records. And I guess also like the Ry Cooder acoustic stuff, although I didn't really absorb at the time, like I didn't learn it off of records at the time. Like I was more thinking about the slide playing, and so it wasn't until later that I went back and listened to like how great all the acoustic finger picking stuff is that he does on those 70s records. And there were other things also, like the more I thought about it afterwards, like the Richard Saslow Ragtime Guitar Book, which I will still recommend to anybody who will listen. And then just, one-off things here and there, like learning, Don't Think Twice, It's All Right, or learning Alice's Restaurant, or these different things. But the main thing that it made me think about is how little I can actually spit that stuff back note for note. Like Taj Mahal is another one. Like there was an afternoon I spent with the record player and a capo on, like learning how to play Buck Dancer's Choice instead of going to whatever class I was supposed to be at that afternoon. But when I went to teach Buck Dancer's Choice decades later, I had to go back and listen and figure out, first of all, to realize like, oh yeah, that's actually not a Taj Mahal song, which of course I didn't know when I was 20. And then also to realize that the Taj Mahal version, like I didn't remember exactly how to play it, and that it was really different from the version, that was first recorded in 1927. And the same thing like with John Hurt stuff. In fact, I had this hilarious dinner one time with Happy Traum and John Sebastian, which was just sort of ridiculous that happened. But I was in Woodstock to do a homespun video, and the night before, Happy was like, well, do you mind if John joins us for dinner? And I was like, John, who? And so, of course, like I wanted to get them to talk about, well, they ended up talking about all kinds of really interesting stuff. And one of them was that they had done this, there's a homespun video that John Sebastian and Happy Traum made about the music of John Hurt. And these guys, of course, like were around. I mean, Happy Traum was in the Village when people, when John Hurt got rediscovered and they brought him, you could go and sit and watch him at the Gaslight or wherever. And John Sebastian had gone down to Mississippi and like hung out with John Hurt and John Hurt's family. So these guys knew John Hurt and his music. And they said when they got together to make these videos, they realized they didn't really know exactly how to play them like John Hurt. Like they had to go back and listen, and they were like, oh, it's trickier than we thought, which I just thought was fantastic. Because really, the thing is, nobody cares if you can play the stuff perfectly. Nobody cares if you can play it note for note. And when I was learning to play, there wasn't I couldn't find a note for note transcription of John Hurt. There were like those Stephen Grossman books that had some of that stuff in it, but it was so hard to decipher what was going on because I didn't have the records anyway. And, he says like flat out in every one of those books, the tab accompanies the records. Go find these recordings and learn the tab, by listening to the records, and use the tab as a guide to see where your fingers go. But, for the things that I had records of, I didn't have tab. For the things I had tab of, I didn't have records. So, you just figure out a way to do it. And so you absorb stuff, and you absorb the feel of stuff, and maybe some of the ideas. And, if you're lucky and someone can sit down and show you, well, it goes like this, or, oh, it's that chord, or guess what, it's capoed, or, hey, did you know he's in an open tuning, right? Like there's that great story Robbie Robertson tells about how he spent like 3 weeks trying to play like Elmore James when he first heard him, and his fingers were bleeding. And then finally someone said, well, Elmore James uses a slide. So, it's great if you can get those kinds of pointers and those kinds of ideas. And being somewhat in the explaining business, like I'll write out these things for people to learn, but when they come back and play them, I don't really care if you did this lick exactly like I wrote it out or that thing. I care more about things like, is the timing good? Did you drop a beat? What order are the sections happening in? Is there a less awkward way you could do that? That was one of the really eye-opening things too that I read in an interview with Jorma. I never know how to pronounce this guy's last name, so I'm just going to call him Jorma because that's easier. He said, if you're learning one of my arrangements of Gary Davis's stuff and it's hard, you're doing it wrong. He's like, I'm always trying to find the most straightforward, most effortless way that just falls under your fingers, right? And so, yes, there is totally value in learning how it was done. And I really value any time that I spent going in and trying to figure out exactly what was going on. Like when I figured out that Buck Dancer's Choice and Alice's Restaurant were played with a capo, and that Dylan wasn't using bar chords, but it was capo to the fourth fret, I was like, yeah, that's really good to have figured out. That's really good to know. And there's something about putting your fingers in exactly the same place that someone whose music you love put their fingers. That's really satisfying. It's like just walking in the same path, and you get something from that. And you also, the guitar is such a sort of, there's such specific idiomatic ways to play things that it's valuable to know exactly how someone did something. But at a certain point, it's more important, or it's as important, to get to sort of the root musical purpose of what you're doing. When I was talking to my friend Rob, once I got through the litany of guitar players, I was like, oh, well, yeah. And then there were all of these jazz musicians I really loved, like all these 50s musicians like Hank Mobley and Lee Morgan on Blue Note, and all of these, and there were all these piano players that I really liked, like the solo Jelly Roll Morton recordings and James Booker and Professor Longhair. And the thing is, I remember sitting down and thinking, well, now I'll transcribe and arrange some Jelly Roll Morton. And that lasted about 10 minutes because I was like, well, he's in E flat, and the span of what he's doing is from here to here, and it's just, forget it, it's just not going to sit on the guitar. But I still kept listening to that music and wrote some guitar pieces that were inspired by like the structure of the tune. Like, oh, he does this thing where he's got an A section and a B section, and there's the C section, and he breaks from the swing feel to do a Latin rhythm on the C section. That's interesting. And so sort of the rhythmic comportment of what he's doing. And the same thing with James Booker. Like, come on, the guy was a freaking virtuoso and a genius. And getting that stuff literally on the guitar, I mean, it would be hard to get it literally on the piano if you were an amazing piano player, although I'm sure there's tons of people who can do it. And so it's at that point, it's like, well, what is it about the music that's inspiring? What is it what is the vibe? What's the feel? What's going on rhythmically? There are all these things you can absorb on a slightly more macro scale than, does this note fit with this bass line? Maybe it's just the bass line and you do something different on top. Maybe it's something about the licks and the phrasing and the voicings on top, but you have to compromise in terms of what the bass does when you get to the guitar, right? Or pulling out even further, like, how do these people deal with form? Where do they improvise? Where is it arranged? What is it about the way that a New Orleans pianist plays that's different from the way like someone like Meade Lux Lewis or Albert Ammons plays the piano? And are those things related or not? So when I say no one cares if you can play it right, I just mean if you imagine the end result, which is you playing your guitar for someone, for a microphone, for an audience, for your friend, for your dog, whatever. The end result of you sitting down and playing through something all the way through. What matters? When you're studying, the accuracy matters because you're trying to get inside something. Stylistically, you're trying to get inside someone else's head artistically. And so when you're working on stuff and when you're practicing, and you're figuring stuff out, then yeah, accuracy matters, because someone played a particular chord at a particular measure. Like, it's worth figuring out what that chord was as close as you can. That's part of how you learn. It's part of how you learn to teach yourself. But when you're then figuring out, how am I going to play this song? Or how am I going to write my own song or my own instrumental in this vein? How am I going to improvise? How am I going to put together my arrangement? Listen, the Taj Mahal version of Buck Dancer's Choice does not sound like the original version. There's a whole lot of different notes. There's a whole other section in there. You know, and are you going to walk up to Taj Mahal and be like, you blew it, you know, your arrangement sucks because it's not exactly like, no, that's how things move forward. That's how things evolve. So, you know, I'm sure Taj Mahal learned that tune in some way. Maybe he learned it note for note and decided he was going to do his own thing with it. Maybe from the get-go it was just like, close enough, and I want to do this other thing with it too. I don't know. I only know, like, you know, what happens when I try to work stuff out, and it's a little bit of both. So all I'm trying to say is accuracy on the way in while you're working on stuff, but then don't be afraid to be less than letter perfect on the other side and make something that you want to out of it, and do something interesting with it on your own.